All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to picture a beautifully painted movie set. Imagine a classic Hollywood backlot, and this set represents our modern American economic debate. It's honestly the perfect visual for what we're going to unpack today, because we're exploring this huge, widening gap between the economic buzzwords we hear every single day and the actual policies operating behind the scenes.
Now, if you're just looking at this town from the street, from the proper camera angle, the signs are freshly painted, and the whole scene looks totally real. It looks substantial enough to actually live in. You've got a bank with these grand marble columns, a union hall with tall, proud windows, and two rival campaign offices facing off right across the town square, one promising liberty, the other promising equality. From the front, it all looks incredibly grounded.
But then, you walk behind the buildings, and you realize, wait a minute. The marble is literally just plywood. The windows open up onto absolutely nothing. The entire structure is completely hollow, basically just propped up by unfinished lumber. And this perfectly captures the emptiness of our current political rhetoric. The familiar signs are still hanging out front, words like capitalism, socialism, free markets, equality. But the structures behind them, they just don't match the words painted on the front anymore.
This is a fantastic metaphor because it shows how both major factions maintain these hollow facades, even though they're empty in two completely different ways. On the progressive left, the rhetoric has fallen way behind their own most serious economic thought. And meanwhile, over on the Republican right, their actual policies have completely broken with their professed free market principles. We are going to take a hard look behind both of these facades today.
Section 1. The Engine of Markets. Why the Baker Bakes. So, before we start tearing down those political movie sets, we need to ground ourselves in how actual economic mechanics work. Let's look at a classic thought experiment about a local bakery. Suppose the baker already has a steady stream of customers. Why on earth would they bother refining the recipe, cleaning the shop, or paying an experienced employee more than the absolute legal minimum wage? I mean, if private ownership gives this baker overwhelming power, as some folks suggest, why not just make the cheapest acceptable loaf, charge the highest possible price, and pay everyone the bare minimum?
Here's the kicker. It's the market mechanism. Competition places the baker's self-interest inside a system where getting what they want actually requires offering something other people prefer to the alternatives. It works because the customer can literally just go buy their bread somewhere else. The employee, they can leave for a rival bakery that pays better. The baker can absolutely choose the price and the wage, but they can't choose whether others accept them. Their self-interest is entirely constrained by competition.
Section 2. The Socialist Revision. Keeping the Market. What's really fascinating here is that serious modern socialist thinkers actually looked at that baker example and accepted the devastating force of it. They realized they had to figure out how a bakery improves if customers can't leave and the producer can't fail. And that brings us to market socialism, an idea championed by thinkers like David Schweikart and John Romer. Instead of old-school central planning, they actually want to keep decentralized competitive markets. Firms still compete, prices still carry information, businesses can still go under. But they want to change the interior of the building. They shift the firm's governance to the workers and investment over to public funds. The whole goal is to prevent the ownership of productive capital from concentrating in a separate investor class while still keeping those competitive pressures that discipline our baker.
Section 3. The Liberal Counterpunch. The Hayekian Challenge.
Now, this socialist revision gets a pretty strong counterargument from the liberal side. The Hayekian reply, which is rooted in the work of Friedrich Hayek, points out that markets do a lot more than just allocate known resources. They actually utilize knowledge that's dispersed among millions of individuals, stuff like local conditions, temporary opportunities, unmet needs. An entrepreneur might spot something that bankers, experts, and central authorities completely miss. So the argument goes that an entrepreneur's discovery, their risk, and their reward really can't be easily separated from their authority to just act on those fragments of knowledge without having to go ask a democratic majority or a public bank for permission first.
And this right here reveals a deeply serious underlying intellectual disagreement between two very sophisticated camps. It's not just some cartoon battle of greed versus compassion. It's really about which forms of peaceful association society should permit and where concentrated power presents the greater danger. The socialist legitimately fears that concentrated private capital is eventually going to dominate workers' investment in politics, but on the flip side, the liberal legitimately fears that transferring investment authority to democratic institutions just allows political power to become direct economic gatekeeping.
This whole dynamic was perfectly highlighted by Gene Epstein during a debate with Jacobin founder Bhaskar Sankara. Epstein asked this incredibly simple yet powerful question about market socialism. Why must the alternatives be prohibited? He pointed out that capitalism is a broad enough framework to actually permit socialist forms of association, like worker cooperatives or communes, to be freely chosen and tested in the market. But socialism, even market socialism, inherently requires imposing a restriction on private capital and conventional wage employment.
Section 4. Behind the political facades.
All right, so we've looked at the serious economic theories. Now let's step back behind the plywood structures of today's actual political parties. Guys, there is a massive disconnect between the philosophies painted on the front of the buildings and the actual policies operating inside. You've got mainstream Democrats borrowing the moral urgency of socialism, but mostly just proposing redistribution within capitalism. Then you have the DSA pushing old-school centralization. And on the right, you have Republicans claiming free enterprise while at the exact same time implementing tariffs and industrial policy. Let's break these down.
Let's start with the progressive facade. The left's building is frankly hollow for two big reasons. First off, mainstream politicians who lean into the rhetoric of democratic socialism, pushing for things like Medicare for all or wealth taxes, they're really just regulating and redistributing within a private ownership capitalist system. They aren't touching the core socialist question of who actually governs the firm. And second, organizations like the DSA that do claim the socialist identity, they're relying on old-school nationalization models that modern economists like Schweikart and Romer already realized they needed to move past. The rhetoric simply does not match the serious thought.
Okay, now let's walk across the street and look behind the Republican facade. Their building has a totally different problem. The Republican right deeply understands the market principles they claim as their ideals, stuff like competition, limited government, consumer choice, but they actively contradict them. In practice, they're using tariffs on steel and aluminum to protect selected industries, and they're using industrial policy to let officials pick winners, completely overriding free enterprise. It's a huge, fundamental contradiction between the sign on the door and the actions happening inside.
And finally, Section 5. The questions that matter.
As we kind of pan the camera back from this whole political movie set, we realize something super critical. Arguing over these empty labels teaches us absolutely nothing about how an economy actually functions day to day. The real difference between systems isn't whether human self-interest exists. I mean, humans are going to be imperfect in any system, right? The real difference is what institutional constraints are placed on that self-interest when things go wrong. These are the actual questions we should be asking. Can an investor transfer their losses to the taxpayers? Can a big established firm just use government regulation to block new competitors? Can public officials actually admit they backed the wrong enterprise with public funds?
Ultimately, we have to look past the fancy signs and ask who really bears the loss in a system. We need to know who actually has the decentralized power to just walk away from a bad deal. What allows the customer to leave a bad business, and exactly what allows the worker to refuse a bad wage. That exit power, that ability to say no, is the true measure of economic leverage.
I want to leave you with this really profound question from the source material to chew on the next time you hear a politician using economic buzzwords to mask a plywood facade. Must society agree upon the future before an individual is permitted to try to create it? Does an entrepreneur really need permission from a public consensus just to test out a new idea? Keep that in mind as you navigate the economic movie set of our modern political landscape. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the questions that actually matter.